Chapter 2. Hanging Heroes. The back of Indy's gown was in shreds, and he held it together with one hand as they passed through the gate of the campus. But he didn't give a damn. He was just grateful to be free of cops and crooks and dogs. He was graduating, and that was all that mattered. He glanced up at a banner fluttering in the breeze. "Celebrate Founding Fathers' Day, May 23rd," it read. At the sight of it, his stomach knotted, and his sense of relief vanished. With everything that had just happened, he'd almost forgotten about last night. What had seemed like a notable way to end his college career no longer felt so wonderful. As they reached the end of the lane leading to the mall, they stopped. A crowd of black-gowned students and their families were gathered on the sidewalk. Above them, bodies dangled from ropes high up on lamp posts. From where they stood, the hanging mannequins looked like actual corpses dressed in American Revolutionary garb, complete with loose white shirts and vests, tight-fitting pants, and three-cornered hats. "Well, look at that," Shannon said with a mischievous grin. "Georgie, the two Toms, and Benji." Indy stared glumly at the sight. The thrill had definitely worn off. "I don't know. It's sort of grotesque in the daylight. I guess I didn't really think they'd still be here." On a weekday, the campus maintenance workers would probably have cut them down and carted them away by now. But it was Saturday, mid-morning, graduation day, and everyone was stopping and staring. "Well, I think it's great," Shannon grinned and slapped Indy on the back. "We pulled it off." There wasn't a trace of concern in his voice. "Yeah, swell. Look, the press is even here. It's your chance to tell them all about it." That was his original intention, but now he wasn't so sure he wanted to take credit for the deed, much less boast about it. Maybe it hadn't been such a good idea to postpone it from the night before Founding Fathers' Day to the eve of graduation. Maybe no one would understand. Shannon punched him lightly on the shoulder. "There are my folks. See you in a while." Indy watched him drift into the crowd, then walked over to where photographers were snapping pictures of Tom Jefferson. Several people were talking at once, and the words struck him like blows to the gut. "Who could have done it?" he heard someone ask. "What was the point?" "There's no point. It's horrible. Must have been a Bolshevik. I've heard they were on campus. Maybe it was a royalist. I'm sure they must hate Franklin. A mad Englishman." No one seemed to find it humorous or to grasp its meaning. Now he was barely able to contain himself. He felt like shouting that it was just his Founding Fathers' Day exhibit, and didn't they understand what these men stood for anyway? "It's a disgrace to the university," an authoritative voice boomed from under the next lamppost. "An outrage of the worst sort." Mallory Mulhouse, the university president, was surrounded by reporters, students, and parents. His face was ruddier than usual, and his brow was covered in sweat. Founding Fathers' Day was Mulhouse's inspiration. It involved a day of speeches and patriotic adieu, and although no one was forced to participate, it was considered a gaffe for undergraduates to ignore it. During Indy's first 2 years, when he'd lived in a dormitory, the floor captains had been responsible for getting everyone involved in making floats for the parade or other related projects. Last year, when he'd moved into an apartment off campus, he'd avoided Founding Fathers' Day. But this year, Mulhouse had required everyone taking a history or an English course to write a paper on the Founding Fathers, or fail the course. Indy had grudgingly abided, but in his own way. "Anyone who would hang effigies of our nation's founders from the lampposts of an academy of higher learning is clearly a dangerous, unbalanced individual," Mulhouse continued. "I consider this an act of sedition, an affront to everything this nation is about." A frown furrowed Indy's brow as he worked his way closer to Mulhouse. He'd expected controversy. He'd wanted it. But he hadn't counted on Mulhouse considering it some sort of high crime against the nation. "Don't you think it was just a college prank?" one of the reporters asked. Indignation seized Mulhouse's face, reddening it even more. "If it's a prank, it's in extremely poor taste. Whoever was behind it will be found and proper punishment will be meted out. Are you saying that hanging these dummies could be considered a criminal act? Another reporter called out. The university police have been notified, and our lawyers are looking into the legal aspects at this moment. Right now, I'm not discounting anything. Dr. Mulhouse, isn't what we see here simply an example of freedom of speech as professed by our founding fathers? Asked a student Indy recognized as the university newspaper's editor. Mulhouse pointed to Georgie behind him, who was now being cut down by one of his assistants. Young man, hanging an effigy of our country's first president on a lamppost of a university is not an example of freedom of speech. On the contrary, it's a threat to it. Damn, it wasn't going well at all. Indy looked down at the mortarboard in his hand and wondered if they could still take away his diploma. Then what? He'd be out of luck, that's what. But he should have thought about that last night. What do you make of it, Jones? He turned to see Ted Conrad, his history professor. He was in his early 30s, wore an old-time handlebar mustache, and was Indy's favorite instructor. Indy shrugged and gazed at the nearest dummy. Someone went to a lot of trouble. Looks like a parting shot at Founding Fathers Day to me. A hint of a smile shadowed Indy's mouth. Could be, I suppose. He admired the professor for his forthright manner as well as for his compelling ideas. Conrad had repeatedly told the class to stand up for what they believed, to question authority. Freedom of speech, he'd said, meant expressing yourself any way you wanted, as long as it did not harm anyone else. That was what democracy was about. Conrad had also poked gentle fun at the exalted stature of Founding Fathers Day, and when he'd assigned the required class paper, had prodded them, saying, "Keep in mind when you write this paper that you're attending a university, not a church." Indy had done just that, and now Conrad suspected him. He was sure of it. "What I see here, Jones," he said, smiling as he motioned towards the hanging figures, "looks a lot like what you were suggesting in your paper." Indy suddenly realized he was as transparent as water to Conrad. "I didn't say they should have been hanged. My post was that if the British had won, our great founding fathers would have been branded traitors and probably hung." "Oh, I know your point. I liked that paper. Gave you an A." Great. He understood. "Then you can appreciate what I did here," Indy exclaimed. "This was my parting Founding Fathers Day project, Democracy in Practice." Conrad nodded. "Only a week late, but still nicely timed to coincide with your graduation. I admire your boldness, Jones, but you're still going to have to face the consequences, you know." He looked down at Indy's torn gown and the white, hairy legs which protruded from beneath it. "Nice outfit, by the way." Indy felt like an insect trapped on flypaper, still alive but ready to be squashed. He stood at one end of a long conference table in a richly appointed room on the fourth floor of the administration building. It was smack in the gray, cold heart of the university, a place few students ever ventured. Seated around the table were the dean of students, the history department chairman, a member of the university's board of regents, two university lawyers, and Ted Conrad. Except for Conrad, who'd turned him in, all were severe-looking older men in gray suits. Suddenly, the door opened and President Mulhouse strode into the conference room. He greeted everyone around the table, then looked up at Indy. "Take a seat, Mr. Jones." Mulhouse pointed to a chair at the opposite end of the table. He'd been roused early yesterday morning by two university police officers and questioned in their office. He'd confessed everything, except Shannon's participation. Dean Williams had been present, and after the police were finished, he questioned Indy for another half-hour about his personal life. The dean, a distinguished white-haired man, had once been a psychology professor, and his questions reflected that fact. Finally, he'd been ordered to appear here today at 10 sharp. "The nature of American patriots and traitors," Mulhouse mused, tapping his finger against Indy's Founding Fathers Day paper. "Well, that's better than hanging heroes, as the press calls this episode." He peered at the new graduate over the rims of his pince-nez and stroked his chin, one of those practiced academic gestures at which he excelled. Did you think you could really get away with this, Mr. Jones? I. Indy cleared his throat and tried to overcome his nervousness. I'm not trying to get away with anything. My paper is about the fine line between popular heroes and treacherous villains. If the British had won. But the British didn't win, Mr. Jones, the History Department's chairman interrupted. And when you hung the effigies of our national heroes, our founding fathers, from those lampposts, you were acting like a traitor. And that's precisely how most people see it. I think we need to consider some mitigating circumstances in our judgment of Mr. Jones, Dean Williams said. I had a long talk with him yesterday morning, and I believe that he is a disturbed young man. His act was not so much an attack on our founding fathers as against his own father, his only living relative, the renowned medieval scholar, Dr. Henry Jones. As I understand it, Dr. Jones is a very busy man, and unfortunately he did not have the time to travel from New York for his son's graduation. There apparently has been some resentment on the son's part regarding his father's aloofness, and what took place the night before graduation is a manifestation of those feelings. It annoyed Indy that the dean discussed him as though he weren't in the room. And what was he saying? Sure, he felt resentment towards his father, but that wasn't why he'd hung the founding fathers. He was about to say so when Ted Conrad spoke up. Well, that's an interesting analysis, Dean Williams, but I'm not sure it has much to do with Mr. Jones' actions. His motives were obviously related to his founding Father's Day paper. The paper itself was well thought out. Rewriting history is at best speculative, but the events he described were well reasoned. Mulhouse's mouth pursed with disapproval. Are you condoning his actions, Professor Conrad? Indy sat forward. Excuse me, but no, I'm not condoning what he did, Conrad said, ignoring Indy. He went considerably beyond what was required or allowed for such a project. I'm just explaining what I think motivated him. It was obvious that Mulhouse wasn't buying any of it. Of course, you can look at it psychologically or academically, but the fact remains that Mr. Jones was illustrating his disrespect for our nation's founders and his distaste for Founding Fathers' Day, an institution at this university. They talked a few minutes longer about his motives, with everyone agreeing that, whatever they were, he was wrong. Then Indy was asked to leave the room. Can I say something, please? He asked as he stood. Mulhouse frowned at him. Go ahead, young man, but keep it brief. All I want to say is that my father has nothing to do with what I did. I never once thought I was symbolically hanging him. With that, he turned and walked out of the room and took a seat in the outer office. He sighed heavily. He imagined them continuing their conversation, talking about the alternatives, deciding his future, and trying to dissect his personality in the process. At the very least, he was sure that Mulhouse intended to take away his diploma. What would he do without a degree? He wouldn't go to Paris, that was certain. He'd have to find a job. But what kind of job? Without a degree, he couldn't even teach French or Latin. He didn't want to think about what he might do, because he didn't know. Several minutes later, the door opened, and Dean Williams nodded for him to rejoin them. As Indy sat down, Mulhouse's gaze flicked towards him. Now, Mr. Jones, you are fortunate that I am someone who listens closely to what others have to say. First of all, our attorneys and I have discussed the possibilities of prosecuting this case. It is our consensus that there will be no benefit for that institution if we carry the matter any further, at least in a legal sense. We prefer to put this behind us. Come on, just get this over with. Say it. Say you're taking away my diploma. The easiest way of handling the matter would be to simply expel you, but you've already graduated. Lucky for you. His smile was cold and hard. However, we understand that you are planning to attend the Sorbonne this fall. We can easily refuse to send your records, and it's doubtful whether you would be considered a legitimate student. His pause was deliberate, to let the significance of what he was saying sink in. But we're going to give you a chance to redeem yourself. Mulhouse glanced among the others, and they nodded approvingly. I would like you to apologize to everyone here for what you did. Then write a letter of apology, which my office will submit to the press." Every eye in the room turned towards him as the men waited for him to reply, but he didn't have anything to say. Why should he apologize for something he wasn't sorry for? What about standing up for what he believed in? What about democracy? Conrad was staring intently at Indy, and the message was implicit. Accept what they're offering you. Indy looked away from him, irritated that Conrad, who'd betrayed him, who couldn't even stick to his own principles, should now presume to advise him. But if he didn't apologize, he knew Mulhouse would make good on his threat to withhold his records. The lesser of two evils, he thought, and said, "Fine, I'll do it." Mulhouse nodded and smiled thinly. "Well, we're waiting. Let's hear it." Indy looked down at the tabletop. "I apologize to all of you. I'm sorry. Sorry I did it. Your office will have my letter of apology tomorrow." Then he pushed away from the table, stood, and walked quickly out of the room. He descended the stairs two at a time until he reached the first floor, then headed across the mall. He didn't know where he was going. It didn't matter. He was literally seeing red. "Jones! Hold on, will you?" It was Conrad. Indy kept walking. "Jones!" He stopped, turned. "What do you want?" "I want to talk to you." Indy realized he was standing just a few feet from the lamppost where he and Shannon had hung the first mannequin. "I suppose you'd like me to climb up there and hang myself," he said, stabbing a finger at the lamppost. "Or maybe you just want me to apologize to you personally. Is that it?" "Calm down, Jones. You did just fine in there. Just fine." "Sure. I did great." "Listen to me. You made your point. Believe me, you did. I talked to Mulhouse at his home for almost an hour yesterday, and he conceded that he'd overreacted." "Well, I didn't hear him apologizing." "No, but you didn't find yourself arrested either. Those lawyers could have drummed up any number of charges from vandalism to treason. Don't you see? You won. Hell, if booze were legal, I'd buy you a drink." "I won, but I had to apologize? What kind of victory is that?" "Look, Mulhouse has to maintain his cloak of credibility. If you had ripped it off by refusing to apologize, he would have had no choice but to ruin your chances at the Sorbonne." Indy knew Conrad was right. "What about this apology I have to write?" "It's your chance to explain to everyone what you were doing. Just don't gloat. Say you know it was a mistake." "Yeah, I suppose." Conrad clasped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. Good luck in Paris. I envy you. I'm sure you'll do well and find what you're looking for." As Conrad walked away, Indy thought about what the professor had said. What was he looking for? He didn't know, but he had the feeling that he'd recognize it when he saw it. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.